Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're going to start breaking down the individual articles early on here in the Constitution. Now you might think, oh, that doesn't seem cool. It really is. Because today we're going to be talking about Article 1 specifically. So we had kind of did a precursor of the 7 different articles. We're going to go here through the first 3 in detail. Not today. Today is just going to be Article 1 and talk about Article 1 in detail and understand how our legislative branch, which is Article 1, how that plays out, how that affects society, how that affects laws, and what it does. All right. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right. The national government, Part 1, talks about the legislative branch. Now, the legislative branch is Article 1 of the Constitution. So, Article 1 really spells out how our government, our federal government, is going to make laws. And we're going to talk about that in detail here today. So this is the national level. The state level, and we will talk about the state level in detail when we get there. But the state level, most states are going to mirror in some way. Let me roll up my shirt sleeves here so as we get into it. Most of the state levels are going to mirror, at least in large part, the federal government. So we're going to go through and talk about these right here. Let's start with Article 1. So Article 1 says, Article 1 establishes the legislative branch of our government. This is Congress. So there's going to be 2 houses, and we're going to talk about both of those today. We are what's called a bicameral legislature. All right. There is bi means 2, cameral, I guess, mean houses. So you have the Senate and the House of Representatives. So our Congress is made up of those 2 things. In order for anything to happen, these 2 houses are called, these 2 groups of elected officials, and this is a unique group and this has a unique group. They actually have to agree in order for anything to actually move forward. So the House of Representatives and the Senate, this is all spelled out in Article 1. The primary purpose of Congress is to make laws. Now, they do have a couple other things. We're going to talk about that here today as well. A couple of the other things that they are entrusted with that is not making laws. But in large part, we're going to talk about today how you pick these people that represent America, how long they serve for, why they're different, what their main job is, how things happen, and then we're going to talk some about some of their extra stuff that they do. So one of the biggest things that Congress does, actually, I mean, this is like 90% of it, is bills, all right? And I'm actually going to spend a whole lesson, not today, on how a bill happens. A bill is basically like a law before it's a law. Like it's somebody's idea. Like, I think there should be stop signs or whatever law you want to make. When somebody introduces that, and it can either be in the House or the Senate, and we're kind of talking about the difference of those here in a little bit, that is called a bill until it becomes law. Now, we have a country of 350 million people, a guesstimate, all right? 350 million people. There's a lot of bills that get introduced, all right, to become law. The vast majority of them don't make it, all right, are never going to become law. And I'm going to spend a whole lesson talking about that because it's crazy what has to actually happen for something to become a law. But, so how does Congress, which in the 2 groups, you have the Senate, which is made up of 100 people, and then you have the House of Representatives, which is made up of 435 people. Now, 435 people seem like a massive amount of people, but when they are representing 350 million people, it is a drop in the bucket. So how in the world, because all these bills get introduced all the time, how does Congress have the ability to go through, read all these, and when I say Congress, I'm talking about combined Senate and House of Representatives. How does either one of them have time to read all these and go through them and figure it out? Well, the vast majority of the work that's going to take place in the House of Representatives or the Senate is going to be in something called the committee system. So what happens is you might have somebody a small group of people in the Senate and House of Representatives, and we'll just talk specifically in the House of Representatives, that is like, all right, they're on, on military stuff. So any laws dealing with military, there might be a group for that. Anything that has to do with safety, all right, which is probably where the stop sign situation would come into, that would be their own little group that's called a committee. You have anything to do with, agriculture, there might be an own little group of people that do that. So there's all these committees everywhere. So if it's a stop sign, the first, before it goes and everybody votes on anything, whether it should be a law or whatever, it goes to committee. And the committee, who's kind of specializes in that area, or whatever that bill is going to decide whether or not that is a good idea or not, kind of with themselves. If the committee's like, no, we don't need that, or that's not necessary, or we don't like the way it's written, and committee says no, it's gone. It never sees the light of day, and they're like, next. So the first big step of a bill, and we'll talk about this in detail, is really through the committee. But much of what Congress does is based on the committee system. So, and we're going to talk about here in a second. We'll go ahead and do that now. So if you're on a committee, you have a lot of power, all right? Especially over your little niche, your little thing that you deal with. You have a ton of power because you can decide what goes on and what doesn't. So everybody wants to be on a committee that's elected to the House of Representatives because that's where a lot of the power is. So how do they pick who gets to be on these committees? Well, generally speaking, it's like a seniority system, meaning whoever's been there longest typically gets picked to lead these committees and give them more power. It's not required to go that way. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says you have to do that, but that's generally how it works out. So if you've been elected 20 times in a row, clearly, your constituents, basically the people that you represent, they like you. And you've been in Congress longer, you know how things work. So typically it is on a seniority system of who gets to lead these committees. So committees are extremely important in the House of Representatives and the Senate. They also give some oversight in the other branches, but the main job of committees is to decide whether a bill goes forward or not. So in a two-house legislature, the Senate and the House of Representatives, that they're both the same, they have leaders, all right? Now, the leader of the House of Representatives is called the Speaker of the House, elected by the House members. The way this works, because America is a two-party system, there can be a third party, but the more we talk about how Congress is set up, you realize how it would be very difficult for a third party, anything that's not a Republican or Democrat, to really have a lot of power. Because whoever the majority is, so if there's more Democrats than Republicans, then the Democrats are the majority party, and in that situation, Republicans would be the minority, or vice versa. If there's more Republicans, they're going to be the majority party, then the Democrats would be the minority party. Generally speaking, whoever has the majority, they're the ones that get to pick who's in charge of the House of Representatives by the Speaker of the House. So the leader of the House, and this is really important because whoever the Speaker of the House is, all right, also gets to appoint who's in charge of all these committees. So when one political party has the majority in the House of Representatives or the Senate, all right, they get to pick who's in charge of the entire House of Representatives, and then that person gets to pick who's in charge of the committees, which is almost always somebody from their own political party. Because of that, having the majority in the House of Representatives or the Senate is very important for your political party to try to have as much power as possible. Now, so the House, this was designed in the Constitution to be elected by the people. All right, there's 435 representatives that they can represent little small parts all over the country. That is elected by the people. The Senate is kind of the adults in theory, because if you have 5 counties in the middle of some random place in the middle of America, you could get some random representatives that represent the views of that group of people in the middle of the country. All right, or wherever that is. So you can get some very interesting people in the House of Representatives because they represent very small groups of people with very specific interests. Senators are supposed to represent a whole state. So they're supposed to be more normal, more efficient. Because of this, in the Constitution originally, the people didn't get to elect senators. To kind of counteract, maybe all the people are crazy and they're electing crazy people. To counteract that, they create a situation where the states are supposed to appoint the senators themselves. In the early 20th century, they passed the 17th Amendment, which we had talked about in a previous lesson, which says, nah, we need the people to have as much control as possible over the government. The 17th Amendment, so present day, the citizens, us, we vote for not only the houses as we always have, but we now also vote for the senators that represent our state. The leader of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. Now, they don't really, all they do, because there's 100 senators, so if they tie 50-50, the vice president shows up and breaks the tie, all right? So it's not really a thing. In large part, so when I say it's not really a thing, that rarely happens. It does happen sometimes, but it rarely does, because usually there's a majority one way or other in Congress, and so there's not a 50-50, because generally speaking, political parties all vote the same way. With all that being said, whoever has a majority in the Senate, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, they're really going to have the majority leader. So it's not called the Speaker of the House, it's called the majority leader in the Senate, and they basically act like the Speaker of the House would. They get to appoint committee members that they basically do whatever they need to. Whoever is the leader of the other political party that's considered the minority, they're expected to work with the minority party. Now, in order for anything to happen in Congress, you got to have everybody in the House of Representatives agree. Well, the majority, they have to be able to agree and pass a law in the House of Representatives. And then in the Senate, once they pass the House of Representatives, it goes over to the Senate. And the Senate has to look at the same thing and agree to it. And only after that, all right, after both, and they don't agree a lot. Once they agree on something and they both vote to pass it, then it goes to the president. The president has a decision on whether he wants to sign it into law or not. So with a two-house legislature, it seems very complicated, doesn't it? It seems like there's not a lot of stuff that gets done. And that is actually by design. The biggest downfall, it appears, of a two-house legislature is things move at an incredibly slow rate. Trying to get anything done is very difficult because everybody has a different opinion, and unless, large majorities here agree with this or that, nothing really takes place and nothing moves forward. That is kind of the purpose, all right? Because our founding fathers did not want knee-jerk reactions, all right? They wanted things to have to go slow. They wanted a weaker central government. So the federal government actually does have power. The compromise was, if the federal government has this power, it's got to be really hard to change or implement stuff without massive consensus, without massive support for it. So that is why the two-house legislature, while the biggest downfall of it is things move really slow, is actually by design. That way you can't be like, this puppy bit me. All puppies are illegal. You can't do knee-jerk reactions. You have to really talk about things move real slow. And then after a while, if you're trying to put your anti-puppy bill through, you'd be like, you know what? Maybe we overreacted. Let's just not do this anymore. And that happens all the time. These bills start getting passed through, and then they die in committee or otherwise, and everybody realizes we should have just never tried that to begin with. So the question is, what is the purpose of the two-house legislature? All right. And then the biggest downside, also the best reason for having it. So we have talked about the biggest downside, we just did. What's the purpose of the two-house legislature? You basically have to have different views. The House of Representatives is the people's house. In theory, originally elected by the people, and then the Senate was like the government. They have to agree on stuff to get it passed. So it's multiple perspectives, and everybody's supposed to agree on it. That is the purpose of a two-house legislature. So you get fair laws, and it represents people more accurately. All right, let's go through and talk about, let me talk about party whips here, and this is kind of a random term. I don't know how often you'll see it, but a party whip is usually somebody that has got some seniority, that people like him, that he's charismatic, he or she is charismatic. So if the Democrats want to pass a bill and they have a majority, and they're like, we're going to have a bill that says everybody wears blue on Tuesdays, I don't know, something random, that the whip's job, who's just a random assigned job, they have to go around to all the Democrats in their own political party and make sure that they are going to vote yes on this if they put it forward, because you don't want to put a bill out there and then your own party vote no for it. So they're called a whip because you're whipping up votes. So party whip, both sides have it, and it's basically they want to make sure before a vote happens, they know exactly how everybody's going to vote on it. So let's talk about specifically the House of Representatives and how they're elected. So we're going to hold off on the Senate. The precursor here, spoiler alert, the Senate is a lot simpler, a whole lot simpler than the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives has 435 representatives. All right, here's a map. And I believe this is whichever year this is from, sometime recently. So red typically represents Republicans, blue represents Democrats, and then the white ones are independent. So there are third parties. They just aren't very popular. Means they're not very common. If you look here, you see how close both sides are. Like, it's usually very close on who is going to have the power. So there's 50 states and 435 representatives. How does that break down, you ask? I'm glad you asked. So this is from the 2020 Congressional Reapportionment. Apportionment is a fancy word that says, how do you divide up that 435 seats? Granted, everybody wants as much representation from their state as possible. So I'm teaching you in North Carolina right now. If you will see here, North Carolina has 14. So we have 14 representatives that represent North Carolina. Now, if you live in North Carolina like I do, not all 14 of those representatives represent you. One of those representatives will represent me because my district, which is about 5 counties, will have a representative that represents all 5 counties, and then they represent the federal government. So those 14 people have 14 separate districts in North Carolina. So you see, like, Texas here has 39. California is 52 or 53 at the time of this being printed. They're not really sure where that's going to fall yet. Why do they have more than North Carolina? Because they have more people. House of Representatives is based on population. The Virginia plan, if you remember that from the Great Compromise. So the larger your population, the bigger piece of that pie of 435. So like you see Texas here, they gained 3 seats from last time. Well, that doesn't mean that number 435 grows. If Texas gains 3 seats, guess what has to happen somewhere else in the country? They had to lose seats. So New York here, that red one in the top right, that's 25, they lost 2 seats because their population actually went down. Texas population goes up. So because of that, that is how they apportion that, they divide up that 435 different seats. Another unique thing about the House of Representatives is when you're elected, you're only elected for 2 years. It's one of the shortest terms out there. This is done on purpose. The reason people in the House of Representatives at the federal level are only there, they have to be voted in every 2 years, is because the opinions of the American people change quickly. So in the Constitution, if you elect somebody there, they need to be representing your current ideas and your current thought processes. So every 2 years, people in the House of Representatives, and a lot of times they just get reelected because they did a good job and people still like them, but they want to give the American people the opportunity every 2 years to vote in somebody that represents their district, all right? So if you're a representative and you're in the federal government and you're from North Carolina, you are not necessarily representing North Carolina. You are just representing like the 5 counties that you're from. So representatives are very specific on what they are representing here. So the question here is, the members of the House of Representatives only serve 2-year terms. Why do you think their terms are shorter than most other elected officials? And we just talked about that. So pause me. Let me read this. answer these, and then we'll move on. All right, let's talk about the Senate. All right. So the Senate, every state has 2 senators. Now, if you're a senator from North Carolina, you represent all of North Carolina, even though there's another senator that will also be from North Carolina, and every state has the same amount of senators, regardless of population. Every state has 2 senators. There are some places like Montana that have more senators than they do representatives because their populations are so low. So the Senate has 2 representatives from their state. So like in the House of Representatives, you just represented your one district. It's not like in the Senate's dividing the state in half and like you represent that half of the state and I'll represent this half of the state. The senators are expected to represent the state as an entirety, so they overlap, which is fine because usually they're both the same political party, usually, but sometimes you'll have one Republican and one Democrat, and I'll show you a map here in a little bit. But so the leadership in the Senate, number one is the vice president. All right, the vice president, this guy or girl, as it stands now when I'm recording this in 2021, they go in and break a tie. So that's really their only job, but they had the final say-so here in the Senate. There's also the president pro tempore, which basically means is the temporary president. All right, so the vice president is the president of the Senate. The vice president is never there. So you actually have a temporary president. You never talk about this guy. This guy or girl never really gets mentioned because it seems like a really important position. What they do is they're basically like the hall monitor of the Senate. They basically call things to order. They're like, we're going to vote on this, we're going to do that. They basically follow a script that is designed already. The most important person is actually going to be the majority leader. So if it's the mainly Republicans or Democrats, if it's mainly Republicans, the head that gets picked by the Republicans would be the majority leader. That's the guy or girl who gets to basically create the calendar and basically forces the temporary president to, whatever he's going to say. He makes like the script for the temporary president. So they actually have all the power. So the majority leader is the most powerful, but they are expected to work with the minority leader because a lot of times in the Senate, instead of just having a majority on things, you have to have a 2/3 majority in certain situations. So you have to work with people in your other party. So the Senate, in theory, usually acts more like the adults of the 2 House of Legislatures, more so than the House of Representatives. So as I talk about them being adults, this is one of the most incredibly ridiculous things to me, and it's been used over time. So if they're getting ready to pass a bill that you don't like, you can do a thing called a filibuster in the Senate. So if the other political parties get ready to pass a bill and they have all the votes for it, before they vote on it, they say, does anybody have anything to say? And people hop up here, and it's called a filibuster, and they will just start talking. They cannot vote on the bill until you are done talking, no matter what you're talking about. So there are situations, this is called a filibuster, you're just trying to talk it to death, where people will like just read the phone book and stuff like this. Now, you're not actually canceling the bill. What you're doing is you're making such a big scene, it brings a whole bunch of attention to your calls, and people are like, why is this guy making such a big stink about this? If he's willing to make a fool of himself up here doing this, maybe there's something to his objections to this. So a filibuster is you just talk things to death, which it seems like it's such a 3rd grade way, like, I'm not gonna let you talk, so you can't do anything. I'm not gonna let you talk, which is pretty much what a filibuster is. There is the Senate Rules Committee. Hey, there is a committee for Senate Rules, which talks about you can call cloture. If 2/3 of the people there vote, this guy needs to shut up, you can make him shut up and then move on. There's all it's like playing Monopoly, man. Like the random little backyard rules that take place in the Senate is kind of ridiculous, considering for the most part they are the adults. Senators, because they're supposed to be the adults and they're more streamlined and they're more reserved and things like that, and typically they serve for 6 years. All right. So while people in the House of Representatives serve for 2 years, senators serve for 6 years. And the idea, because the president only serves for 4, the senators serve for 6, trying to give some stability to the government as these other places are transitioning out, because they represent entire states and there's another person from their same state that they represent with. Generally, they're like the longest elected officials, generally speaking, on large scale, mainly because they're supposed to bring stability to the government as these other people are coming and going, possibly. So that's the question. Senators serve for 6 years. Why do you think they serve longer than most other elected officials? Answer this in complete sentences. Pause me if you need to. And we're going to move on. All right. Non-legislative powers. There is a couple things that Congress has that has nothing to do with making laws. All right. One of the most important ones is oversight. Let's talk about oversight first. So oversight, basically, they're supposed to keep an eye, because it's checks and balances. They're supposed to keep an eye on the executive branch. So if the executive branch is doing something weird, that they will basically call the executive branch, basically call the executive branch to defend themselves and things like that. They're supposed to keep an oversight over the executive branch to make sure they're not doing anything weird, because they all have checks and balances on each other. This particular picture here is Gerald Ford. We had a president named Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did some shady stuff and was getting ready to get impeached, and we're going to talk about impeachment here in a second. Before he could be impeached, he quit. He quit the presidency, and it made Gerald Ford the president. Richard Nixon was still guilty, or still in trouble of committing these crimes, which was like messing with an election. So what Gerald Ford does is he pardons Nixon just so he can move on from it and run the country. The Oversight Committee was pretty upset that Richard Nixon had broken the law and looks like he got away scot-free, and they are basically grilling Gerald Ford here in the Oversight Committee over why did you pardon him instead of letting him go forward. So, and his argument was, we just needed to get back to normal and run the country. That was taking up so much time we couldn't actually govern. Makes Gerald Ford unpopular, but his logic behind it isn't awful. But there's a lot of fallout and made him unpopular, but it wasn't a criminal act. But it is where the Senate's Oversight Committee basically grills the president to get to the bottom of things that they think the executive branch might be doing wrong. The next big one is impeachment. America, at this point, 2021, has had 3 presidents be impeached. Impeached means you are being put on trial for breaking a law. If you are found guilty as the president, if you're found guilty, you are kicked out of office. The House of Representatives is the one who says, you're up on charges, and they basically charge you. Then the Senate is basically your jury, and they have to vote whether or not to kick you out of office. Right? It has to be like 2/3 majority. We have had 3 presidents impeached. Now, we talked about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon would have been impeached, but he quit. All 3 of these men right here have been impeached as the president. All right? You got Andrew Johnson in the 1860s. He was a Democrat. He was impeached by the Republicans. All right? And for violating the Tenure of Office Act. The guy in the middle, that's Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a Democrat. He was impeached by Republicans. He was impeached for lying under oath because he said he was not having an affair with a White House intern, and they proved he was. So he was impeached for that. Donald Trump is a Republican impeached by Democrats for delaying an investigation. He was actually impeached twice. One was right after he had left office for inciting a January 6th riot. That was the charges that were brought against him. All of these were the opposite party bringing charges against a president of the other party, and there's 3 guys, but 4 impeachments. All 4 were found not guilty. because it ends up going down party lines almost all the time. So none of these guys were ever kicked out of office. So impeachment sometimes can be used as a political tool. And it is rare, but impeachment is very touchy in Congress. Because when you impeach somebody, all right, especially if it's something that society will eventually view as trivial, you're basically opening up that can of worms for it to happen when your guy or girl is president, if it's not your political party. Also, because the president is the most visual elected position in America, if you stand up against the president at the time, but your district likes the president, it could really cause you not to get reelected, which is the number one goal of everybody in Congress, is get reelected. So it is like playing with like a political hand grenade with impeachment. Not only could you set your party up to be impeached in the future, but at the same time, it is also, you don't want to lose your seat because your district, your constituents, people you represent, like the president, but you're impeaching them. So it is a very touchy subject in Congress with impeachment, because you don't know what the fallout is going to be. It's usually something big. People feel very strongly about it one way or other, but it's a very, very touchy subject in Congress. All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. Answer this in complete sentences, and I will see you tomorrow.